like the eternal city that is Rome. Rising upwards like a heavenly choir, like the eternal.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show this Friday. It's always the best day of the week, and we have on a great guest. So it's going to be a wonderful show. So just to jump right into things, that wasn't the best intro, but Thomas Lyons, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Michael. Excited to be here, and thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And so I'll just ask right off the bat, going to seminary, kind of jumping right into this story. What led you to seminary? How many years ago was your decision to attend seminary, to pursue the priesthood?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in the seminary for about a little over 4 years, about 4.5 years. And this was, at this point, I guess I had entered the seminary in 2016 and then left 2020. So still fairly recent. But yeah, spent those kind of 4.5 years studying for the Archdiocese of San Antonio. Loved it. And I'm sure we'll kind of get into all the ins and outs of it. But yeah, that's kind of the above view of it.
Yeah, so how long were you discerning before you actually took the step to go to seminary? What was that
Yeah.
process like?
Yeah. So look, in hindsight, right, my whole life leading up to it. So I was 18 when I entered. And I would say there was kind of a period of, I think the first time that I had actually realistically thought about it and said, well, God, if you want me to be a priest, I'll do it, was probably end of junior year of high school, and then certainly all through senior year. I think by the time senior year had rolled around, I was kind of knew that that's where my heart was, and didn't apply to any colleges or anything like that, and knew, hey, seminary was where I was going to go. So it's probably a 2-year period of kind of really intense discernment, but then all kind of little small movements of the Spirit throughout my life growing up.
Yeah, for sure. And so when you got to seminary, this might be jumping too far ahead, but when you got there, did it meet your expectations? Were you too courageous when you were first really looking into anything? Like, did anything surprise you in those first few months?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody does. I think that every guy who walks through the doors of seminary, and I imagine it's the same for every young woman and every man who goes into religious formation, it's hard to know what to expect. So, I think everyone expects walking around and all holy and pious and a bunch of monks and praying. But it was really normal. I think that's the first thing I thought when I walked through the doors was like, oh, this is like college. And so I loved it. Obviously, nothing that kind of, um, was negative about the first couple months. It was all positive. It was just different. You don't really know what to expect. But I loved it. And not too difficult of a transition for sure.
Yeah, and so I don't know if you know this, but I used to work at the Abbey of Gethsemane,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
so I was working alongside the monks. I was expecting that they would be praying while they were working, out loud, praying all the time, and just living really pious lives. But it is really normal, so that is kind of a surprise there. But yeah, speaking about the religious life, did you ever consider that option as well?
So I did briefly, when again in kind of that initial discernment period, just a lot of it through curiosity. Like I didn't have any priests in my family. I had two guys who were a couple years older than me from my own home parish, who one went the religious route, the other was in the diocesan seminary. So asked kind of questions between the two of them, but from pretty early on, it was clear that my heart was in the diocesan life, and that's where I felt called. Later on in seminary, about kind of halfway through formation, I started to kind of reapproach that discernment into the religious life, and that's actually kind of what eventually led to me discerning out. But for the most part, about 80% of the time, it was always the diocesan life that really spoke to me and was kind of my view of the priesthood.
Yeah, so you said the religious life actually discerns you out of the
Mm-hmm.
priesthood. So I didn't know that part.
Mm-hmm.
Not to spoil the story, but you did get married at the end of this. That might be spoiling this entire
Mm-hmm.
episode, but yeah, tell us about this religious life adventure
Mm-hmm.
in between of this marriage and
Mm-hmm.
seminary.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say probably about 3 years into seminary. It was right at the time I was finishing up minor seminary and then moving into major seminary, which is always kind of a pivotal part for discernment, right? Because then you're going from it just kind of is that next step, and usually by the time you hit major seminary, it's like, hey, you're kind of locked in, and that's when it becomes clear that that's kind of the route you're going to go. So I was kind of doing that discernment to prepare for that and prepare to graduate from minor seminary. And in that prayer, I felt that God was still calling me to the priesthood, but the diocese kind of felt less and less like home. Those kind of initial stirrings were, hey, well, maybe God is calling me to the priesthood, but in a different way. So I actually went and spent some time discerning with the Dominicans, just did a come and see retreat with the Eastern Province Dominicans, just because, I loved the work that they were doing. I love the spirituality. And I was there and I loved it. But I realized that no, I think my heart is not calling me here, but so I came back to the diocese after that summer,
Yeah.
and then I started to realize, like, oh, maybe God isn't calling me necessarily to a different order or a different diocese, but instead just kind of reevaluate priesthood as a whole. So it's kind of that's what I mean when I say that looking into other orders was kind of what I thought that's where God was calling me, but in reality it was hey, it's time to start kind of coming out of seminary.
Yeah, and so I'll ask a few questions that some of the viewers might be able to relate to. Any other young men that are really discerning for themselves. So the first one of those questions is, what fears did you have about seminary? Did you have any fears in your discernment process, like
Mhm.
fears that you would live a lonely life being a priest or anything along that nature?
Yeah, the whole thing terrified me. I speak about it with such joy and hindsight, right? And like I can see, the providence from day one now looking back. But no, I was a scared high school kid when I first started, feeling this call to the priesthood. I was about 16 at the time, and I didn't really have any real plan for my life. Sports and dating and all, like I was living a really normal life. I loved the church. I was super involved in my home parish, but priesthood had never really kind of crossed my mind. So when I first started kind of feel drawn towards that, I was like, well, God, there's no way. You're making a mistake, and this is just a phase. It'll pass. But it started to be more and more. And I think the biggest thing that terrified me is again, I didn't even know how you became a priest, right? Like I just knew that I had this conviction and I wanted to follow it through, and I loved God and I was grateful for everything He had given me. So I wanted to serve Him. So it was mainly just I remember one of my prayers, actually, in kind of a pivotal moment in my discernment, was I was sitting in the adoration chapel and I was praying and I was like, God, well, this has been going on for months. I think you're calling me to be a priest, but if you really want me to be a priest, you're going to have to show me how to do it, because I don't even know where to start. And literally, after I said that prayer, I got up and was kind of angry and left the adoration chapel. And as I was walking out of the door, the parents of the guy I mentioned earlier, who was actually in the seminary already, I literally bumped into
Yeah,
them. Um, and I said, like, hey, how's your son doing and all of this, and they said, good. You know what? Here's his phone number. I think you should give him a call. And then he was the one who eventually was like, I talked to him and I said, hey, I'm thinking I'm called to this, and he brought me into the seminary, showed me around, introduced me to the vocations director, and that kind of been that was the opening in. So all that to say, I was really nervous, but once I kind of laid those fears to Christ, He said, okay, fine. No, if you're open to it, I'm going to make it happen, sort of thing.
yeah, and so this might be an interesting follow-up question. Did you have any fears after discerning out of seminary? Did you feel like
Yeah,
that was a waste of time or any
yeah, I
anxiety
think
next?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's the biggest temptation, and that's really kind of what a lot of my ministry now is geared towards, is trying to get rid of that stigma, right? So, I use the term of a seminary dropout, right? Because I think that's how a lot of the men and women leaving formation feel, right? They feel like, oh, well, I failed, right? And I think that people are incredibly gracious and kind when you're in formation, and I think that they kind of put the cart ahead of the horse a lot of times, and start calling you, oh, like, baby father or padrecito, right? We're in San Antonio, so everyone speaks Spanish, right? You get kind of this, even though you're 7-8 years away from ordination, they're already expecting you and so excited for your priesthood, and you're not even there yet. So there's a lot of
Yeah,
pressure I think, to stay in. And but so when I was leaving, I wanted to be sure that God was actually calling me out, and it wasn't just, out of any fears. But I think the way I look at it now is, leaving seminary isn't it's not nothing changed, right? It wasn't oh no, never mind, this isn't for me, or oh no, God's not calling me this. But rather we need to approach it the same way we enter, and which comes from a yes, right? It's saying, God, where do you want me today? And trusting that the same God who placed you in seminary is the same God who's calling you out, and will take care of you the same way he did in the start of the call.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think one fear that a lot of people have is that they hear that the religious life or the priesthood is a higher vocation in life. And so if they're looking at marriage, they might feel even more attracted to marriage, but they hear that like higher vocation, they feel like they're selling themselves short by going the marriage route, which you eventually did. So tell us a little bit about your experience grappling with that. Was that ever really a thought in your mind?
Mhm. Yeah, I think for a little bit. But again, I think that I obviously knew my parish priest and liked him and looked up to him. But I think a lot of my discernment was just born out of a desire to serve, right? I knew that I loved the church. And my prayer wasn't, necessarily about God, show me my vocation. Am I called to priesthood, or am I called to marriage? But it was mainly, God, where am I called? Where can I give back? Right. I mentioned my parish had a wonderful youth ministry program. And I always looked at all the volunteers, right? Some were married, some were just young college kids, right? I looked and I said, God, where do I fit into this? And put me there. So, I was discerning that. And, I saw the beauty in both, right? I had incredible married couples as witnesses in my parish, and I also had great priests and seminarians that I knew. So I think from a very early age, I saw the beauty of both vocations. But there is certainly that temptation of, when you love the church and you want to serve, I think every guy looks at a priest and says, "Man, I could do that." And then especially if you're there and you're hearing homilies and you're like, "I could give a homily," right? Like there's a little bit of that, and I think that also helps too. Of that kind of draw of like, man, that it would be cool, right? It would be awesome to be able to celebrate the sacrament. So it's certainly there. But I think the best approach is not to, put them against each other as higher versus lower, because we're all called to holiness, right? That's the highest vocation of them all.
Yeah, and so how has your relationship with Jesus changed now that you're a married man versus when you were a discerning man, somebody discerning their vocation in general?
hmm Yeah, I think the biggest way is really just understanding Jesus as, really ironically, kind of as a priestly figure, more deeply, right? So, and understanding his compassion more. I think that obviously, as when you're discerning the priesthood, you're discerning this idea of taking care of a community, and it almost becomes a little bit more abstract, right? Like you're kind of taking care of a group of people rather than individual, right? And my relationship with Christ now is asking him and begging him constantly, hey, let me be a good husband, right? Like let me minister to my wife the same way that you ministered to your apostles. And um really trying to know him on a more knowing Jesus's more intimate relationships, right, with his apostles and Peter and those kind of one-off stories, rather than when you're a priest you look at things obviously like the Sermon on the Mount, or him kind of preaching to the masses. But knowing his heart as an individual talking one-on-one to people is what is speaking to me now more so than before.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great answer right there. And so might seem like a uh, out of field question right here, but are you a father yet? So any
No.
children?
No, so no kids, just my
Yeah,
wife and I right now. Yeah, obviously it's all in God's timing. Again, that's one of the perks of kind of going through seminary formation. You learn that life just becomes, you leave yourself open to it, and when God's ready for it to happen, it'll happen. So but as of now, it's just my wife and I.
yeah. And so I have a question now, kind of looking to the future. We've been talking about the past. So if that day does come, and hopefully it does, having children, how do you think that will affect you really in your personal spiritual life, your growth? Pretty much, you've been growing this entire
Mhm,
time. What effects do you think that will have? It's kind of a hard question to
mhm.
ask, but
Yeah, no, it's a little bit terrifying, but growth always is. I think, the more I've been praying about it, and especially kind of in this time, and the more that, I think that there is an expectation, right, for when, young Catholic couples get married. I literally, the day of my wife and mine's wedding, the priest afterwards said, "Cool, I'll see you in 9 months for baptism." He said it jokingly, but that's the expectation. And obviously, we're open to that and we love that. But in this kind of period since we've been married and haven't had kids yet, I've been able to kind of grow in this understanding of, what it means to be a priest for the family, right? And adopting that. And I think God has given me this time period to really understand what it means to be a priest as husband, and then to be, one day hopefully a priest as a father, and being the head of the household, and all of those things. So I think that hopefully when that day comes, and I'm raising kids side by side with my wife, learning how to lead them and inspire them in prayer, and cultivate their own spiritual life. That way they can kind of continue on when they get older.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great answer right there. And you kind of answered the other question I was thinking of. So to go back a little bit further, just speaking about your ministry in general here, your ministry now, why did you think it was important to really aim your ministry around helping other people who were in the discernment process? And so we
Mhm.
could probably bring in your podcast now. So you just launched a podcast last week called Continuing the Call. And we'll talk a bit about that at the end there. But yeah, why did you start your ministry like
Mhm.
this?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it was because it was a resource that I wish I had, when I was going through my discernment. Is, you hear a ton about the guys who get ordained, and the men and women who end up taking religious vows. You don't hear a lot about the guys who don't get ordained, and those who leave formation after a period of time. Um, and I think that only added to the pressure, right? I was like, oh man, there, again, is that stigma of seminary is a priest factory rather than a house of discernment, right? And I think it's really important that we approach it as a house of discernment, especially for younger guys like myself. I remember signing paperwork and just like, cool, here's the next 9 years of your life, and then you're going to be a priest. It doesn't leave a whole lot of room for that question of, well, what if I get halfway through and realize it's not for me? So my goal in the podcast is kind of twofold. One, to get rid of that stigma, let people know that, hey, if God is calling you to seminary for a season, then say yes and enjoy it, right? And get what he's calling you to get out of it, and be docile to be able to confidently say, yes, I want to be a priest and God's calling me to be a priest, or no, thank you, God, for, giving me this time. And I can see, you're calling me elsewhere now, and leave gracefully. So I think that's number one is leaving those men and women who are discerning an avenue to do both. And then the second is to highlight the great work that our past seminarians and religious are doing. A lot of the amazing figures in the church today started as seminarians. That's where they kind of got their call, and now are lay men and women, but they're doing awesome things that took place in the seminary, right? One off the top of my head, I believe Exodus 90, which is a massive company that everyone knows that is doing incredible things and bearing great fruit, came about from their time in seminary. And I want to be able to highlight stories like that.
Yeah, that's a great point there. Just people using their experience from seminary to do great things, even if they don't pursue the priesthood all the way. So I'm going to have to ask some of those things in your own experience. How did they help your married life so far? How has that experience in seminary helped you today? And how do you think it will help you going forward for the rest of your life?
Mhm. Yeah, it's good. I'm sure my wife is watching this, so she'll keep me honest. So I can't pass off like, oh, it's perfect. No, I think one, it taught me to love Jesus more. Right? Is like that's number one thing. Of I look at what did I get out of seminary? A deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. Full stop. That is the number one thing, and that's really what I look back on is the biggest gift that I got from my time in formation. But then, the more specifics of that, spending time with, the theology of our church, right? So I have got my degree in philosophy and learning kind of the philosophical traditions of what it means to be husband and married and sacrifice, right? And then the theological studies of the same thing of what does the church teach about the sacraments and what is my role as a husband? What is my role as, to live side by side with my wife? So I think really just kind of the knowledge and just the preparation, right? Like it frustrates me how much we prepare men for the priesthood and how little we prepare couples for marriage. Because I think it is like, if we're saying marriage is vocation, we have to take it seriously. And I think that the marriage prep could certainly be a lot stronger to let these men and women know that, hey, it is still a sacrament, right? It's not just the default, but it's a sacrament that the two of you enact on each other, and how to live that out is super important. And I got all of that foundation through the seminary.
Yeah, for sure. And so my next question really goes back into seminary, back further in this episode. But I think it is a good question just for the viewers. It might help them in their own discernment process. So if you don't mind sharing, this is kind of a personal question, but what were some of those signs that led you to discern out of seminary?
Mm-hmm.
Some of those signs that you had in your personal life or whatnot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that for me, a lot of it was they were the same ones that got me into seminary, right? So one, it was just that feeling of peace, right? So learning where the Spirit is working in your life, right? So my um, spiritual director all through seminary was a Jesuit priest, and so of course it has kind of that Ignatian background. So the consolation and desolation, right? Of if you wake up every day and feel like, hey, this is home, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, and you have that desire to pray and to grow, odds are you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And I guess to kind of keep that consolation and desolation theme, what it was the desolation started to kind of outweigh the positive, right? And not in like a negative sense of, oh no, I've made a horrible mistake, but more of a, I started asking the question of, well, what's next, and where else am I supposed to be? Whereas those times where I knew, I look back at second year of seminary, right, where I knew that that's exactly where I was supposed to be. It was easy, right? I'd get up and I'd pray and go through seminary, and I could see myself on the altar and as a priest. And that just became less and less, and more of a, just kind of asking God, feeling more inclined to ask God, hey, is this actually where you want me, sort of thing.
Yeah, and so I just thought of this other personal question. Is there anything that you miss about seminary or anything that you really look back on with fondness? Any good memories from your time
Mm-hmm.
in seminary?
Yeah, there's countless, right? I loved the time in seminary. The biggest thing was, we literally had a chapel in every building, right? So no matter where I was in the seminary, we had a chapel. I think of the late nights of, it's 11, 12, 1 a.m. And, I've been studying and I'm like, I just need a break. And I can literally just walk down to the chapel that's 2 doors down and be in silence. And it just felt at home. It made the faith feel so much more accessible, and really, again, that relationship with Christ, far more intimate than in this case. Now I have to get in my car and drive to the church. And so just the simplicity of encountering Christ is one thing that I love about the seminary life. And then, of course, the community. I'm still very good friends with a lot of the guys who are in formation and who have gone on to be priests, and then also the guys who also left. Great friends. So the community, and then just the entire life being centered around holiness was kind of the two biggest things that I look back on with fondness.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And so, if there's any young men out there right now who think they're called to the priesthood, they feel like they're about to give a phone call to the vocation director and really sign themselves up for seminary, what would be your first piece of advice to a person like that? What would you say to them?
Mhm. Yeah, advice number one is always, I think that it's crucial to remember that what we're called to before marriage or to before priesthood is communion with God, and leading other people to communion with God. Right, that is our ultimate vocation. Right, it's holiness. Right, um, so be confident. Be confident that there's this idea that your vocation is essential, and it's a puzzle piece that you have to put together. It really can be as simple as where are you closest to God, and where are you leading the people you're supposed to lead to God, right? Like that's it. And that's what the vocation is for, right? So priesthood and marriage, they're means to an end, and that end is holiness. And I think that kind of lets men and women take a deep breath and be like, the God who made me from the beginning and desires my salvation is the one who's, leading me to ask these questions. So you can answer those questions and answer that call with confidence and knowing that God's not going to lead you astray.
Yeah, for sure. And so, do you have any words of comfort or advice for people who don't have their vocation yet? They've been searching for maybe years, but they don't have it yet. They haven't taken any vows. I'm sure you went through the same experience. I think we all do, especially me right now, not being married or a priest or anything. Just that period of waiting, period of discernment. Do you have any advice to get through that peacefully,
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like I'm able to speak of this with hindsight, right? But it's certainly tough, right? And I remember being there. And I think again, it's that idea of, in one sense, you do have your vocation, which is to love Jesus Christ, and to love the church and to bring people to the church. So as long as you're doing that on this kind of path of discernment, you are doing what you're supposed to do. And then other than that, again, your vocation, God is going to call you to something, and your vocation is going to be something that you can achieve practically, right? So like, odds are God is not calling you to go join some order across the world that you randomly found on Google, right? Like your path to your vocation comes from just saying yes, 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 and just walking through the doors that get opened for you, rather than trying to like reach and put pieces together, sort of thing. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So that's great advice right there, and lots of great feedback, and not feedback, but wisdom. Lots of great pieces of advice in this episode. It was a really good show. And so, for our viewers who want to really hear more of your story or hear you asking these same questions, the people who are really discerning this stuff, how do they keep up with you? How do they find your content?
Yeah. So first, I have to give credit. So all this wisdom and everything, it is all due to the people that I learned from, right? So it's very little of it is mine. It's all just my wonderful professors I had in the seminary, the wonderful men and women from my parish, and so it's really just collective. So all the credit and glory to them, and of course to God. Yeah, but with that, a lot of what I'm doing is all just under Continuing the Call. So that's on Instagram, YouTube. The podcast is Continuing the Call, a seminary dropout's guide to discernment. So all those places there. And then just my website is thomaslyons.com, where, again, the whole idea is I'm bringing together men and women who have spent time in formation, or, vocation directors, people who, are kind of experts in this space, and having them share their story to help build a culture of vocations and let people know that at the end of the day, our life is about saying yes to God and being okay with wherever that leads.
Yeah, for sure. So I highly recommend this podcast to everyone. I listened to the first episode just last week. That's when it released, just last week. So do you have, this might be too soon to ask, but have you heard any feedback on this podcast yet from anyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's been my favorite part. I've had people complete strangers that are reaching out and wanting to share their story. So I just did an interview yesterday with a gentleman who had an incredible story kind of throughout his time in seminary. And it was someone who I'd never met. He just heard it and said, this is something that I'd love to share. So that's been the best part. So a lot of positive feedback. And also open to the kind of criticisms, and let me know how it can grow. Again, the podcast is not about me. Again, all the social media, very little of it is about me. It's meant to highlight, of course, Jesus Christ, and then also the individuals who are doing the awesome work. I just kind of see myself as the instrument, so I don't take too much of it personally. If somebody says, hey, you should do this instead, I'm open to it. So that's the goal, is just let wherever the Holy Spirit leads it is where it's going to go.
Yeah, definitely. So may God continue to bless your own life and really bless this podcast so that others can benefit just from the wisdom and grace shared through it. And so, yeah, it's been great to meet you. And a podcast is a great excuse for a conversation. So that's why I enjoy doing podcasting myself. But
it's been great. It's nice. Yeah, it's been nice to meet you and have this conversation. Much easier to talk to you this way than on the floor of NCYC when there's 13,000
Yeah.
kids running around. So, no, thank you for setting it up.
Yeah, I was about to share that story because I think that is a funny one. I was just walking through with my signature hat, the flat cap I wear. Don't really wear it for the podcast, but some of the viewers might have seen it. Then you recognize me. And so that's how we met. And so I would have never heard about your podcast if I never met you in the midst of thousands of people in Indiana. So
Yep.
yeah, it's been great to really meet you and hear your story, Thomas. And thanks again for coming on the show and really sharing all of this.
Yeah, no, of course, and thank you. This apostolate is so necessary. So thank you. Again, I know it's a little bit belated, but congratulations on your entrance into the church, and I know that the church is already benefiting from having you as a faithful member. So keep doing that, and know of my prayers for you as well.
Yeah, for sure. I do really appreciate that. And I really appreciate all of the audience here. So may God bless everyone. Have a good weekend.
Not of the modern world.
For
The modern
yes.
world. That's right.
Yeah,
Bishop Barron. Hello, it's from the airport. Hello, we're doing good. Nice to meet you.
So who are you, sir?
I'm Archbishop Joseph Nauman of the Archdiocese of Kansas City in Kansas.
Yeah, do you want to bless this recorder? Is there a blessing for that?
There's a blessing for everything. So, Lord, we ask you to bless this instrument and use it for good and for evangelization. Amen.